In our studies, we've talked about words and phrases that come up in the Bible. We just finished with the term pure. And now I want to talk about the word discern, or discerning. It comes up often through the Bible. It comes up in various forms in the Bible. I think of Isaiah 5:20. It says that the day will come when they will call evil good and good evil. Well, we're in that day, and it's only gotten worse and worse. In fact, the Bible talks about in Luke 16:15, that which is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. Now, that's quite clear and evident when you look at some of man's religions out there. You look at the ones that are the biggest hit among men are absolutely so far removed from reality and truth as far as the Lord's concerned. I was brought up in one of those, or told that's what I was in my younger days, until the eyes of my understanding were open. You read Mark 16:15, it talks about at the end that if you drink, well, let me read it real quick. Discernment's very important. You have to recognize and understand what is of God and what isn't. And if it isn't of God, you don't want to put your stamp of approval on it. And these signs shall follow. I'm in Mark 16:17. These signs shall follow them that believe. In my name they shall cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. With a new heart, you're going to speak with a new tongue. You're going to be speaking the things of God. You're going to know. The Bible says, unto you is given to know the mystery of the kingdom. To know, to discern, to understand. And they shall take up serpents. And if, in other words, you're going to stomp on the devil's head and send him fleeing. Resist the devil and he will flee. Not the other way around. Christian, you shouldn't be running away or living in fear. They drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick and they shall recover. If you drink any deadly thing, there's a lot of deadly doctrines going around by a lot of people who haven't discerned between good and evil, that don't know the difference between what is of God and what is man. These are deadly, poisonous doctrines. The Bible uses the term serpent. A serpent is slithery. He sneaks in quietly. He bites. You can get hit with a little poison, and little by little, it'll pull you down. It'll take you down. Poison can be a slow death. And a lot of these doctrines of man are slow death. Paul wrote in Galatians 1, around verse 8, he told them, I marvel, 6 through 8, I marvel that you're so soon removed from him that called you unto grace unto another gospel, which is not another gospel of Jesus Christ. You're so soon removed. Well, where'd you go? How did you get removed? Well, the devil didn't pull you out physically, but spiritually, he deceived you because you got lazy. You got dull of hearing. Hebrews 5 talks about that. And Paul said that in Hebrews 5:11, of whom we have many things to say and hard to be uttered, seeing you are dull of hearing. Dull means lazy and stupid, for lack of a better term, stupid. There was a guy that did a comedy routine a while ago saying you can't fix stupid. They become stupid, that's on them. If someone becomes willingly ignorant, there's no more you can do with it, especially after they've known the truth. And I've seen folks that have known the truth that have become willingly ignorant. Dull, lazy, stupid. For when the time you ought to be teachers, you have need that one teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. For everyone that uses milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe, a child. Children are gullible. They do what other people tell them. They're easily swayed. But strong meat belongs to them that are of full age or maturity. The Bible also uses the word perfect, as we'll see as we go along, which refers to maturity. Even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. What senses? Your spiritual. To discern. To know the difference. To know the difference. To discern. And discernment means to recognize. To know. It means to separate. 2 Timothy, is it 2 Timothy 2:15? Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. It's kind of like the butcher. You cut the meat, you trim the fat, you get away from the bone, and you're eating the meat of the word. The bone and the fat is not healthy. You rightly divide what is of God and what is to be discarded, which is unhealthy. But this is done by reason of use. Exercising, and we see the word strong in here. Well, if you look in the world, strong people are those that exercise constantly. They exercise themselves. Well, they stay strong because they continue this pattern, this routine to stay healthy and strong. Well, spiritually, you have a body. You have Christ in you. You need to feed him. You need to feed him something spiritual. You need to feed him the word of truth. The question was asked early on in my walk, and it's still relevant today. Do you feed which gets the most attention, the carnal or the spiritual? That'll determine your outcome. That'll determine the kind of life you're living today. Are you feeding the spirit man as much or more than the carnal man? Which one gets the most attention? You do have to find a balance. The Bible talks about a just weight and a balance. I thought I had a verse for that. Proverbs 11:1, I believe, talks about that. A just weight and a balance are from the Lord. You need to have a just weight and balance of anything you do in this world. What is of God? What is of man? And same thing with your talent. If the Lord wants you out there working in his field, you need to be out there working, but you don't want to be entangled in the affairs of this life. But discernment is so important. Let's look at Philippians 1. And I'm at verse 9. And this I pray, that your love may abound yet more and more in knowledge and in all judgment or discernment. The word judgment means discernment in that verse. That you may approve things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ. Study to show thyself approved unto God. What are you putting your stamp of approval on? Is it something the Lord approves of? And you're going to find as you grow in the Lord and as you mature, you're going to grow out of certain situations. You're going to grow out of certain people. Certain people might be keeping you down. Certain people aren't doing you much good anymore. That may have worked for a season, but maybe now you're going to be in places and maybe an organization that professes to know God, but in works they deny him. Maybe it's time you take a second look at that. Maybe it's time you've outgrown that. I know early on in my walk, I wasn't satisfied with just a Sunday, Wednesday, most of it was singing and dancing, and then they'd spend a few minutes in the Word, and it was over. I went and had to find a home Bible study where it was strictly Word without the song and dance. I'm not a song and dance guy. And that's when the growth, and then as well as sitting down myself and learning to discern between what was of God and what was of man, getting away from all of man. And it's interesting, the deeper you go, the more narrow the path is, the more you realize just how out of whack man and his doctrines are. One Lord, one faith. So simple, right? One Lord, one faith, one baptism. And yet, you pick up a phone book or something, and you've got nothing but denomination after denomination after denomination. That's stupid, which is what the word dull means. Stupid. 1 Corinthians 11. Yeah, you really want to make sure that what you're putting your stamp of approval is of God. I've seen people come to the Lord with a zeal. They start studying the Bible, then they think they can go back to the old. And next thing you know, they go from reality to religion again. They left religion because that wasn't working. They get a dose of reality. They don't like the person they see in the mirror, so they run back to religion. And they end up worse than they were in the beginning. I'm in 1 Corinthians 11. I'm going to start at Verse 28, for let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. Now this is where they get that communion doctrine. For he that eats and drinks unworthily eats and drinks damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. Now, when you talk about the body of Christ, you're talking about a spiritual body. So you're going to find out that, things that the Lord did. He was water baptized, and they partook of the bread and that. But that's outdated, folks. Not discerning. The Lord's, we're to worship in spirit and truth. Let's get away from these carnal, the first principles of the oracles of God, which we talked about earlier in Hebrews. Let's get away from and move on to perfection, maturity, that you may grow up into Him in all things. Quit walking around and acting like a little child in kindergarten. And because of a lack of discernment and not knowing exactly what the Lord's body, the body of Christ, really consists of, or who it consists of, for this cause many. Doesn't the Bible talk about many? Many are called, few are chosen. Many more of the desolate than they of the bride. You can read Matthew 7:21. Many will say. Many had thought they had known the Lord, but they didn't rightly divide. They weren't discerning His body. For this cause many are weak, sickly, and many sleep. I've met a lot of Christians who are weak, sickly. A lot of them are sleepwalking, and some to the point of death. I've seen them fall asleep to the point of the permanent dirt nap, so to speak. They're gone because they just became weaker and more sickly. They weren't strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. They hadn't exercised their senses to discern both good and evil. It happens in the physical. If you don't exercise the body, it breaks down. It happens in the spiritual. If you don't exercise your senses to discern and rightly divide good and evil, you'll break down. For if we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world. Opportunity knocks. The Lord's going to come at your door and knock. He talked about, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Revelation 2 talks about that. Or 2 or 3 talks about, you stand at the door and knock. I want to come in and sup. I want to fellowship with you. But that's the inner man now. We've seen a lot of pictures of the Last Supper. That's great. That was the Last Supper with the Lord here on earth. But there's a new one going on in the realm of the Spirit. He wants to come in the inner man, Christ in you, and sup. He wants to have fellowship. He wants you to feed on His word. He wants to tell you the truth. He wants to show you how to rightly divide the word of truth. But so few really want to hear that doctrine, and it's the doctrine of Christ. The doctrine of Christ should be the rule, not the exception. And yet it's so few and far between anymore. They don't teach about the inner man, the Son of God, Christ in you. Jesus was just a man. They put all the emphasis on the outward man because that's all they can see and understand. And they missed the inward man, Christ, the Son of God, who's seated at the right hand of God. Let's take a look at 1 Corinthians 13, as long as we're in this vicinity. And verse 9, for we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part is done away. I look at that as my understanding. I've had a partial understanding, because the Bible says in 2 Corinthians 5:21, know no man after the flesh, yea, that we have known Christ after the flesh, know we him no more. Don't try to interpret the Bible or discern it with the carnal mind. You'll miss the mark. That's where the carnal mind is empty. That's where people miss the mark. That's why they become weak, sickly, and they're sleepwalking. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. And when I look out there in the so-called religious realm, or the doctrines of man, or what's highly esteemed, it's childish. It's stupid. It's ridiculous. It's not even close. How do I know? I was brought up in one of those. The one located over there in Rome. And it was a big hit. Man loved it. Except for me, it was deadly. It didn't do anything. It didn't feed me spiritually. Never did anything for me. So folks, we're in a time where there isn't much discernment. And the Bible talks about that. In the end times, they will be deceived and being deceived. And it talks about, and let me read one more. I want to read one more verse here in 2 Peter 2:14. One for the road. And it talks about having eyes full of adultery that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls, a heart they have exercised with covetous practices cursed children. These are man's doctrines. These are man's preachers. Covetous. Well, seems like out there they don't talk about money. They got nothing else to talk about. And it says they've exercised. The devil and his workers are out there exercising. The question is, are you? Are you exercising your senses on a daily? Are you studying to show yourself approved? Rightly dividing, knowing what is of God and what is man? Are you strong in the Lord and the power of his might? Or are you becoming weak, sickly, and starting to fall asleep? Church, don't be lulled. Don't be lulled into a dull. Stay strong and rightly divide the word. God bless, church.